Welcome back to Bitcoin Season 2. I've got David Z. Morris, independent tech reporter, contributor to The Rage, and author of Stealing the Future. It's a book about SBF. Welcome to Bitcoin Season 2. David, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So we're going to talk about Tornado Cash. You've covered this. You're one of the primary people covering this, and we'll explain some of the basics. But I want to just ask you, you're an independent reporter. You kind of get to choose what you cover and talk about. What initially drew you to the Tornado Cash story, and why are you covering it?
Yeah. Big, complicated answer. I mean, I think that there's two layers there. One is just the interest and importance, and, relative to everybody else. I don't know exactly why my intuition told me this, but once we got there and started covering it, there were a couple of other crypto magazines. Bitcoin Magazine sent somebody, CoinDesk sent somebody, but even they were only there, a few days out of the trial. DL News, props to them. They sent somebody who was there quite a lot. But I was the only person. I missed one day of the trial. I was there almost every single day. And that is a rare opportunity to get to do something that in depth. I've done it previously for SBF. And the case itself, I think, attracted me because I knew from just my familiarity with the case that familiarity with Tornado Cash, that there were some complexities there, particularly what I think did wind up being significant was the fact that they had built this. It's a decentralized protocol, but there are these other parts to it that they controlled and had revenue coming from of a certain sort. And so those were kind of key issues in the legal aspect of it. Obviously, the importance in the broader context is we do have this ongoing and, we'll get into it. And the legal ambiguities around Tornado Cash there are cases on both sides. I don't want, and I think it's a dangerous way to think that the government is coming after Roman purely for immediate short-term political or control reasons. It is a complicated case, and all of this stuff, there's no precedent. But that complexity is against the background of what I think is a very serious, broader crackdown on privacy. And I mean, the timing is crazy because right now we have all of these age verification bills coming in across the world, particularly in the UK, but even in the United States, in Texas, where people just do not seem to comprehend the threat that this sort of practice poses. And we saw at trial, and again, we'll get into the technical aspect, but, Tornado Cash was is, by the way, it's still operating. It's still legal for a U.S. citizen to use. It's true privacy, which means it collects no data. This concept is very scary to a lot of people, like actual privacy. And so explaining it to them and explaining the risks of sort of compromises and half private solutions, I think is really important. And I was lucky enough both to connect, months ago with Lola Leitz, who founded The Rage and has been creating something really great there. And to be blunt, the other reason that I was able to choose to do this is because we did have a generous funder who backed us. And, the work that I do, being there every day, it's 12 hours a day. It's not cheap and it's in New York, right? So one of the reasons that a lot of, news outlets are not able to send somebody to be there every day is because it's in New York. It's hard to take a reporter from across the country, put them in a hotel room for a month, and then, have that justify the expense of covering a trial in this kind of granularity. So basically just the modern media model does not support the kind of reporting that I like to do, which is, detailed, nuanced, really walk people through what's happening. And thanks to our backing, we got the chance to do that, and we're aiming to make that more sustainable so we can do similar coverage going forward.
Yeah, it's a lot of people think that news just kind of happens and somebody's always there, but that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
So a lot of our listeners, I don't want to assume people really know how Ethereum works. Maybe we don't have to explain that, but it's probably really good that we go back and just explain how how Tornado Cash came to be, and then how that plays into like the current case. So like, what is Tornado Cash? I know there's a bunch of things we could go into, but how do you answer that question?
I think I can do a pretty concise version of both the story and then the text. So the thing to understand, I mean, for Bitcoiners, I think understand this very clearly. It's also true of Ethereum that a blockchain is transparent, and it's there are various versions of technology that change that, Monero, things like that. But Ethereum and Bitcoin and most blockchains are transparent by default, and it's kind of a necessity of how they work because you have to keep track of everything and have sort of confirmations. We're moving in a better direction with some more recent projects, but there's obviously a lot of lock-in on Ethereum. And there already was by about 2019, which is when Roman Storm, Alexei Pertsev, and Roman Semenov had formed a team called PepperSec, and they started they were basically looking for a project to do. And this is key. They were looking for a project to do in the Ethereum ecosystem, in the crypto ecosystem. And they were told by other people that privacy was a really important thing that they could be building. They didn't go out, and this is, we'll get into sort of the legal aspect of it, but they didn't go out saying, like, we need to build something that can enable money laundering. We need to build something that lets criminals get away with their crimes. That was not the thinking. In 2019, they actually went to a hackathon that I'm not clear at this point whether it was actually affiliated with Harvard or just at Harvard, but it was ETH Boston, and they had a hackathon there. They won the hackathon, and this is a public event. There are photos. Unfortunately, they were not allowed into evidence in the trial, but there are photos of these three guys just at a public event wearing Tornado Cash T-shirts and winning this contest. They also got specifically advised by Vitalik Buterin, who very prominent co-founder of Ethereum, that this was a good and interesting project. Another, just like a little sort of snippet that, or a little tidbit that I learned later that I think is extremely significant. Some listeners may know that Ethereum made a transition a couple of years ago from being a proof of work blockchain to a proof of stake blockchain. And one aspect of that was there was a contract that actually converted funds into, either made them stakeable or transitioned them through the to the proof of stake version. I don't know the details, but that contract was actually funded, seeded, and deployed from funds that had been put through Tornado Cash. So the entire current Ethereum blockchain, its kind of root, its key, was anonymized through Tornado Cash. And that's for, sort of political reasons having to do with the perceived neutrality of the system itself. And so that's just one example where there are all of these very legal, very good, very necessary applications of this tool that became significant going forward. So 2019, they win this hackathon. Things are going great. In 2020, they destroy their keys, so they lose control of the contracts and pools that do the mixing. We'll talk about the tech later. And then starting in 2020 and then sort of steadily through 2022, we start seeing large hacks, including hacks by North Korea's Lazarus group, using Tornado Cash to launder money. And at the trial, what we saw, one of the interesting parts of the trial was, for better or worse, the police in the Netherlands seized Alexei Pertsev's phone, got his Telegram messages, and so we saw their contemporaneous reactions to what was happening, and they were freaking out. They were like, "This is terrible. We are going to. This is going to be very bad for us." And one of the aspects of the trial was the prosecution kind of trying to frame this as awareness of criminal use of the tool amounting to criminal negligence.
And
when really they were like, this is bad.
And this happened after they burned the keys. Like, an Ethereum contract, somebody owns it, but you can provably demonstrate that you don't control the ownership of that. So that happened after the key burning event.
Exactly. And one of the and they actually made some efforts through the web front end that they did control to implement OFAC-sanctions lists on blacklisted wallets. One of the real ironies of the situation is that they used this OFAC list and a Chainalysis based or a tool, I believe, built by Chainalysis that deployed that OFAC list. But of course, the OFAC list is just static. It's single wallets. So all anybody had to do was, move to another new wallet and then go through Tornado Cash. So one of the amazing facts of this case is that no money through the period of 2020 to 2022, no money from sanctioned entities actually came directly from wallets on that OFAC-sanctioned list and went through Tornado Cash. It was all a couple of hops, which, reasonably that is Lazarus Group laundering that money, but there's a considerable irony to the fact that OFAC maintains this list. This is supposed to help you manage sanctioned entities on your platform, but it doesn't actually work. And so then maybe you're still going to be guilty of enabling money laundering, even if you're using the OFAC list. So anyway, to wrap up the story, 2022 circa, that's when like the Ronin hack comes down. Ronin is 600 million that goes most of it through Tornado Cash. They basically realize that they are going to be in big trouble. Then charges start coming down. And since then, starting in 2023, we've been watching the legal process move forward.
Just to double tap a bit on exactly what Tornado Cash is, like, what is the Tornado Cash contract or protocol? How do you describe what it does?
So the most important thing technically to know about Tornado Cash is that it's non-custodial. And this is in contrast with some other mixers that Bitcoin people in particular might be familiar with. Tornado Cash was a series of pools on chain, and you could deposit money into those pools in sort of set amounts. It was like 0.1 ETH, 1 ETH, 10 ETH, 100 ETH, and put them through the pools or put them into the pools. In return, you would get a secret generated by the Tornado Cash protocol, basically a text string. And you would take that text string and then you could go start a fresh wallet and then send that secret to the Tornado Cash pools, and you would get your money sent to that fresh wallet. So in theory, this breaks the provenance, the traceability of those funds from one wallet to the next. There's some complexity there. There's a system known as relayers, which give you kind of the transaction fee that you need to get that transfer into the fresh wallet without a connection. And we can get into kind of how the Torn token fit into the relayer system. But essentially, that's it. You deposit, you get a secret, you go to a fresh wallet, you withdraw. And the really key thing there is that neither the protocol nor anybody who was involved in building Tornado Cash at any point has control of your funds. They can't move any money from those pools. They can't track, where the withdrawals go or who owns those wallets. They have nothing. They have no special access. It is completely transparent, completely, open. I'm not transparent in the sense of visibility, but like, what's there is there. There is nobody with special access. And so that, from a technical perspective, I think is the most important thing, because the FinCEN guidance has been very specific, at least in 2019. And I believe I've been told even before that, an entity that does not control funds cannot be considered a money transmitter. And that was one of the three charges here against Roman Storm, was operating an unlicensed money transmitter. That's a whole situation because they had to wind up splitting the charge in a weird way that, that's the one he got found guilty on. And it's basically very ripe for appeal because of the way the charge wound up getting treated. And we can go into the charges in the trial.
We'll go into the charges. Okay. So, and so like, this is a contract. It's really enforced by the network itself and not by the creators. They kind of set it in motion and it just goes. So, this is an important nuance here, which is the difference between the contract itself, the protocol, and the various front ends. I think this is a pretty key thing that is a bit arcane for the both like average users and the poor government officials who have to figure out this stuff. How do you try to explain this? And then, this is the contract still live today? It might be an easy, dumb question, but like a lot of people don't realize this.
No, I mean, it's it's definitely important to explain, especially because, so the front end is, it's a website. There was a lot of nuance about where the front end was hosted at various times. But fundamentally, it's a website, and PepperSec, which is the entity that Pertsev, Storm, and Semenov founded together, was a U.S. corporation. I don't know if PepperSec still exists as an entity, but they paid the bill for the web front end. And that front end, just a website, it basically plugs into the back end, the chain. The same way that a wallet is essentially a front end for you to interact with the Bitcoin blockchain or Ethereum or anything else, a website, that interacts with a chain is very similar to a wallet in that way. In that the website does not contain any information. It doesn't like hold any money. It doesn't, it's really just a way to translate mouse clicks into command line inputs that would actually just like work fine directly into the interface. And so that's kind of but the government basically spent the trial trying to make the case, and I think somewhat convincingly, which is important for developers to notice, is that there really are arguments here that by paying for that front end, PepperSec, that was like part of Tornado Cash as a business. I think that we'll get into some other complexities, obviously, but I think that like the business, the profit element here is where the government really did, I think, make a solid case. There are other reasons that the jury hung and had a mistrial on two charges, having mostly to do with criminal intent. But the business and the profit motive here, I think, does come out because those relayers I mentioned, they use the Torn token. Those were owned, a lot of them, by the founders, who then sold them for, not a lot of money, I should say, and we can get into that. But they did collect some funds from Torn. So there's the front end, there's that, and then there's the relayer system, which again, fairly arcane, not that important to get into. But those were the two elements that the government alleged Storm, Semenov, and Pertsev effectively controlled. And essentially, like at various times, the government argued that they should have built the entire system differently, or that they should have intervened using the front end, that they should have like stopped the activity. And those, I think, are the arguments that were less convincing that, they had any real way to control this. Again, going back to like the fact that the OFAC list is not effective. The tools that existed for them to try and do this were not effective. And one of the really, I think, cringeworthy moments in the trial for crypto experts was, they brought in the prosecution brought in an expert to sort of propose this entirely alternative design for Tornado Cash that would have included like not just a central registry and whitelist, but actually like off-chain tracking of the inputs and outputs, which is like completely not a privacy solution. Was the alternative that was suggested. So yeah, that's the front end kind of has that slight separation, where it's a significant separation, but mostly the fact that they were paying for the hosting and actually actively managing the front end was where I think the government really did have like a foothold, a toehold to get these charges in. And certainly for the MTB charge, basically for pretrial procedural reasons, the guilty verdict on that one was kind of foreordained and impossible for the jury to rule against.
Hey, Will here with Blockspace Media. Did you know that we have individual feeds for all our shows? If you're watching the Mining Pod, Bitcoin Season 2, or the Court Show, be sure to check out the individual feeds. You can find them on your podcast player of choice, whether that be Spotify, Apple, YouTube, etc. Just type in Blockspace Media and you'll find all our shows pop up, or just type in the individual show name like the Mining Pod or Bitcoin Season 2. Be sure to hit that subscribe and give us a 5-star rating so we can continue to bring you the best content in Bitcoin.
So you mentioned there is a private business model associated with this. And this does come into play with, as you say, it like building a case. What was the business model? Maybe we don't have to linger too much on it, but like explain like how they made money. How does this relate to the protocol versus the business, the front end?
Yeah. So it all has to do with these relayers. Relayers were third parties. So, the same way you would think about a Bitcoin miner or an Ethereum node, relayers were kind of like Tornado Cash nodes. What they did was they offered to, so the problem with the way Tornado Cash works is that this fresh new Ethereum wallet that you've started up that has no connection to your previous wallet also has no Ethereum in it. And you have to actually have Ethereum in that destination wallet to collect your funds back from Tornado Cash. But if you sent the little seed money from your original wallet, you've completely defeated the purpose. You've just reconnected yourself back to your previous wallet. So the relayers, for a fee, seeded fresh wallets with enough Ethereum for you to get your money out of Tornado Cash without connecting back to your original wallet. Now, they were, I'm gonna get this wrong because the tokenomics are pretty detailed, but essentially the relayers use Torn staking to get priority on the list of relayers, basically. And then I think that the users also maybe had to use Torn tokens, but I'm not sure on that. Basically, the relayer system broadly created demand for Torn. And the more demand there was for the use of Tornado Cash, the more there was need for these relayers, and therefore it affected the price of Torn. There was no fee to the user directly to use Tornado Cash. And this is really important. Again, it's a message about legal liability to builders. If you're collecting a direct fee, you're not decentralized. That is just basically what it is.
So you have the protocol itself, the contract itself, which operates independently. And then you have a front end, which makes it easy for users to use and interact. And then you have a business, which just helps improve the overall accessibility and UX of accessing the protocol. This is a common like builder's dilemma in crypto broadly, is like, how do you make money off of open source stuff?
Yeah. And I can say that this is actually directly relevant to a case that's pending in Texas right now, where a developer has built a decentralized fundraising platform that has similar privacy guarantees. And he's actually seeking, I don't have the name at the tip of my tongue, but Coin Center and Peter Van Valkenburg are working on this. He's deploying something. He's seeking a preemptive judgment that he's not breaking the money transmitting law because of exactly the Tornado Cash case. And not because he's collecting a fee necessarily, but like the same question of, I'm going to build a front end that makes this easier to use. Is that then going to become, a grounds for them to sue me? And that is still, a declarative judgment is what he's seeking as protection before he releases this software. So we're already seeing signs that these anti-privacy cases are constraining free speech. You have prior restraint emerging on open source developers, not just wondering about how to make money, but how to avoid being prosecuted for these particular interpretations of the tools they're releasing, even if they're not directly involved in how they're operated.
So now we get into the part where I'm the least familiar and skilled, which is exactly how the legal system works and the nuances here.
Yeah.
And we don't have to go into every little detail, but like, what were the charges? Mm-hmm. We recently got a judgment on one of them. How do you want to try to tackle this?
Yeah. So first of all, just very briefly on to finish the Torn token thing.
Yeah.
They did eventually sell those, the founders tokens. And it's actually quite fascinating because basically each of the three founders, they sold and they got about $1.6 million, which it's going to sound crazy, but that is not like that a lot, much money.
For like billions went through this. So,
well, not only did billions go through it, but they worked on it for 3 years. And Roman Storm was, prior to this, a developer at Amazon. Now, compare the salary and benefits that you would get for 3 years as a developer with Amazon to $1.6 million. It's pretty close, which is to say that when you're arguing profit motive as part of the criminal charges here, it's not exactly clear that even if he gets to keep all of this money, which he might or might not, it's not exactly clear that Roman Storm like made off like a bandit here. To a lot of people, 1.6 million sounds like a lot, but when you're a coder, it's, kind of like just that salary. But to get to the charges, so there are 3 charges that were originally brought. One was conspiracy to commit a sanctions violation. Conspiracy to commit money laundering was number 2. And then there was a charge of conspiracy to operate an unlicensed money transmission business. Now, the third one, the first 2, there was a hung jury at the end. We had a mistrial, which means it's not great as far as precedent. It means that the government can retry those charges against Storm himself. And it also means that there is no precedent. If we had gotten a not guilty verdict, that would then become significant precedent for the charging of other similar cases. With a hung trial, with a hung jury, we don't have precedent in those cases. And they can sort of charge on the same theory anybody else who's in a similar position. The money transmission charge is where things get really gnarly. And I'm not even sure that the judge in this case entirely understood like the real sort of one sentence version of what happened, because they initially were charged with operating unlicensed money transmission business. Then the Blanche memo from the Trump administration comes down saying, we are going to stop charging people for simply not registering if they're on chain and doing crypto stuff. So the money transmission charge shifted. And I should say, I've done a ton of media around this. So I think it was an episode of Bankless that I did recently with Peter Van Valkenburg, where Peter explains this very well. And so I'm just kind of cribbing from him on this. But the MTB statute 1600 has 3 or maybe 4 like subsections, and they have subsections. The failure to register is number 1. And then you get down to, I believe it's 2B. I might be getting that wrong, but 2B is sort of a subclause of the charge where if you knowingly handle funds derived from criminal sources, that's also criminal under this MTB statute. Now, what Peter explains is that knowledge standard is different from the criminal standard for money laundering, which Storm was not convicted of. Under a broader money laundering statute, you have to have the intent, not just the knowledge, but the intent to facilitate the hiding of criminal proceeds. And Roman was not found guilty of that because as we've sort of hinted at, the defense really did a good job of showing that, no, this was created for non-criminal purposes to serve a community that wants privacy for legitimate reasons. And that was what really motivated Storm. And you have to read the tea leaves a little bit on the hung jury, because obviously some people did want to find him guilty. But my inference is that some members of the jury saw that and said, no, this was a tool built with legitimate intent that was then misused by criminals. But to go back to the MTB charge, and I'm sorry this is so incredibly arcane, but it is what it is. The MTB charge has that lower knowledge standard. And clearly we saw at trial from the panicked messages that these people were sharing from each other saying, like, this is really bad for us. We are going to get in trouble for something that we did not intend to happen with Tornado Cash, was basically the gist of the messages. But it clearly showed that they had knowledge, right? And the MTB charge, the reason it has this lower knowledge standard is that it has this presumption built into it that you are a registered and legal money transmitter who has control of user funds. That is part of what an MTB is. And so what we have now is a guilty verdict on basically an incoherent charge that presumes Tornado Cash was an MTB with control of user funds. And therefore, if they had knowledge of criminal usage, they should have gone and stopped it. But they didn't actually have the power to stop it. They didn't have the power to reverse it after the fact because of the nature of the tool. So I think, Peter believes, and I think it makes sense to me, that this is just an incoherent charge that the jury had to find him guilty on because the judge in pretrial ruled that Tornado Cash was a money transmitting business, even though that is actually not the definition under the statute. So I frankly think, based on what I know, and I'm not a lawyer, but based on my, knowledge and analysis, I think this is very ripe for being overturned. And I think Roman will not ultimately be found guilty.
Yeah, let's double tap on that again, because I read that this is likely something they'll appeal. Maybe they have appealed. I don't know.
They've declared their intention to appeal. The actual filing process is longer.
I mean, what does that look like? You think that it's probably something that could be overturned, like what does that look like? Where does it happen? Like, if it's overturned, then what happens after that?
Yeah, I mean, if it's overturned, it's overturned, and he's not guilty on that. Or I believe he would be considered not guilty on that charge, as in not vulnerable to double jeopardy on that charge. Unfortunately, he would remain vulnerable to being recharged on the sanctions and money laundering charges. But that's a choice that's up to the government and up to the prosecutors. They would have to basically redesign their entire case from the ground up. And they might not choose to do that. We can get into the government case was a mess, frankly. And part of it was because of this MTB clause shifting. Part of it, though, was frankly I don't want to say incompetence, but certainly some mistakes were made in terms of the government's choice of witnesses, including one who was the victim of a catfishing scam and whose money, it now appears, may never have actually gone through Tornado Cash at all. So this is another reason that I think the jury hung on some of the charges, was because one of the government witnesses did not seem to have actual standing to be there, but was not ejected from the case.
The case has happened over an interesting evolution in how at least the U.S.'s approach to crypto in general has changed. There's a lot of regulatory clarity which has emerged. There's still a lot which is ambiguous or unclear. But the ground has shifted underneath the case as it's happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe let's get into the zooming out, which is the implications of this for privacy. I don't know where you want to take this. Do you want to take this in discussing legal precedent? Do you want to take this in the government attitude towards de-anonymizing privacy? Take this in the privacy direction you think is most productive.
Yeah, I think there's two things there. One is the privacy, but I also want to flag that this has, I think, most direct and serious implications for open source developers, and especially open source developers deploying on blockchains. The way that I'm forgetting who said this, but I'm stealing from somebody. I think actually this is what Tim Clancy is, an Ethereum developer who has been sort of raising the alarm about Roman's case for a while. And the point that he made was that the fact that this was charged in the first place, regardless of the outcome, means that as an Ethereum developer, you now have to think about what use a criminal could make in the future of something that you built and deployed in the past without any criminal intent at all, because it exposes you to legal liability for any use that a piece of software you've built has been put to. And this doesn't just apply sort of by implication to blockchains. It actually applies to any open source software. So one of the points that has been made is that if, for example, this standard were applied to Linux and Linus Torvalds, he would be considered liable for the Iranian nuclear program, because his program is being used to run some of those centrifuges and things like that. So that's the stakes for open source developers, and it's very serious. And this essentially is in many ways a replay of the privacy and crypto wars of the early 90s, the cryptography wars, not cryptocurrency wars, where you had PGP and other privacy code considered a munition for a while by the US government and banned from export. Until a big case involving, among other people, Adam Back got this privacy protocol, PGP in particular, sort of deemed acceptable to distribute. And this is a freedom of speech issue. Code is considered speech in the United States, and so that was one of the aspects that the government here was very careful to not gesture to the idea that creating Tornado Cash was criminal, which I think would have exposed them to very serious First Amendment problems. On the privacy front, though, I do think that it's less a matter of formal legal precedent or standards here than, yes, the very clear intent of the U.S. government and obviously broadly governments around the world, because we also saw Alexei. It is somewhat difficult to keep all the people in this case separate, but was it Roman Semenov who was no? I think Alexei Pertsev was prosecuted in the Netherlands. He served some jail time. He's currently out on appeal. But their process was even more, I won't swear, but effed up than what happened in the U.S. And he thankfully is filing an appeal. And in fact, his lawyer was present watching these proceedings in the U.S. But it is clear that governments are terrified of the implications of losing that control that they have via third-party intermediaries in the financial system. And I don't want to dismiss those anxieties. It's obviously very serious. I mean, if North Korea can use Tornado Cash to, collect $600 million for its nuclear weapons program, we can't just brush that under the rug and say that's okay. I think we do, as members of this crypto industry or community, have to try and figure out some solution to the two sides of that, because we do, I think, have there is a legitimate legal claim to the right to privacy on chain. Tornado Cash still exists, is still operational, and is still legal for U.S. citizens to use. This is very important knowledge that, literally the government doesn't want you to know. The ducks at the park are free. You can use Tornado Cash. But that I think does not mean that we should just be blasé about everybody and anybody using these tools and getting away with it. There has to be some kind of balanced solution there, and I think we need to take that seriously. But that is the sort of stakes here, that if Tornado Cash is not legal to create, then privacy is functionally illegal, because it also implies that WhatsApp is illegal to create, that any kind of actual end-to-end encryption software is illegal to create, because you're criminally liable for whatever use it is put to by anybody who uses it. So, those are the stakes here, is that if there's a verdict that, if the precedent here becomes effectively, you can't create Tornado Cash, then the payoff is online privacy is illegal forever. So
what advice would you give to developers working on privacy tech, especially as it pertains to blockchains, Ethereum, Bitcoin, things in that world? Maybe it's kind of a black pill, or maybe there's things that they can do to protect themselves. What would you tell privacy devs right now?
Yeah. I don't think it's a black pill at all. I think it's a white pill. I think it is the blinding whitest pill of all, which is maybe you can't make $1 million off of this. Maybe you have to actually do it out of principle because you believe in it. And I mean, that is really a tough pill to swallow in this crypto environment where, everybody is getting ridiculously rich. And I would love for it to be, safe and easy for people to get as rich as they deserve to off deploying on-chain privacy solutions. But unfortunately, the legal reality is that collecting fees from a system like this, even using, I don't think the Torn token workaround where they, created this other asset that they held some of and then gave it value. Absent other factors in this case, I don't think that's a defense against sort of a criminal intent claim by a prosecutor. So, I hate to be the bearer of this news, but, this is something that needs to be funded by public goods funding. It needs to be created by people who don't need to 1000x their inputs. I don't think it's venture fundable. One of the other really crazy parts of this trial was essentially through shenanigans, the prosecution threatened one of the defense's witnesses as potentially liable here as an investor in PepperSec. And he wound up pleading the fifth and declining to, which is his right, and he probably was smart to do this, but he wound up declining to testify on Roman's behalf because of the implication that as an investor, he might have been legally liable here, which is taking this to an entirely new crazy level. And The government later tried to walk it back because I think they knew how bad it looked. And in fact, this part of the trial is under seal. So unless you're reading my reporting at the Rage, you actually can't see this conversation. But the prosecutors did indeed say that Thomas Schmidt of Dragonfly Capital was a subject, quote unquote, of the investigation. And Hasib Qureshi, another partner at Dragonfly, later, said that they had, he perceived them as having been threatened with prosecution for being an investor. So I think that goes some ways to show just how serious the government is about pushing every possible button and pulling every possible lever to discourage people from creating these tools. So that's where we are. I think that, we have not at all a victory here, but there is a victory in sight. Again, the hung jury, unfortunately, is pretty bad because it means that they can re-prosecute either Roman or somebody else on a similar theory in the future. And it does raise the stakes for getting the word out, having media outlets like yourselves, like us at The Rage, where we're trying to expand operations, get the word out that this is a social issue. Banning this kind of privacy technology has crazy implications for the next century to, frankly, 1,000 years of human development. And I think we need to get the word out about that in a big way, because the next jury that weighs these decisions, I think that we have a lot, I'm guessing here. I did not end up being able to snag any of the jurors for a direct conversation after the trial, but there were a couple of people who you could kind of tell were younger, potentially more plugged into crypto. Maybe they've heard some of the coverage that has come of these issues already from people like us. And I think that had a determinative impact in not getting a guilty plea. What we want is for the next jury to be aware of these issues in a deep enough way that we actually get a not guilty verdict that sets the precedent. I'm using all this language of we, and so I think we can talk a little bit about journalism if you want. But that's the stakes right now.
Yeah. So much of this is we have what is law, we have the interpretation, application of law, but that's also kind of downstream of just societal perception and understanding of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Like what,
you
mentioned there may be some kind of generational phenomenon happening. What is I also think I live in a bubble because all of my friends, all my information sources were everyone's rallying around Roman Storm. Even some of the most staunch, narrow-minded, hardcore Bitcoiners still kind of concede.
This has been great to see, just to put that out there. Yeah.
Yeah. And which is, I love to see it.
Understand the stakes.
What's your evaluation of the broader public perception? Are people aware that this story exists, that this story is happening? What's the man on the street response? Are you able to kind of evaluate that at all?
Yeah, I think it's relatively unknown. I think that us in crypto are very tuned into it. One sad illustration, unfortunately, I'm a huge fan of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and their work. But because this touches crypto, they filed a very short amicus brief and have basically said nothing at all about this case. They mentioned it in a blog post in 2023, but they have effectively gone out of their way to distance themselves while doing the bare minimum to maintain their credibility as an advocate for online privacy. And I think that's just one example of this being somewhat brushed under the rug, or at least people who, outside of crypto, not fully understanding the stakes or not being willing to reckon with the stakes. As far as the broad picture, it's also frustrating because we have this supposedly pro crypto administration in place, and they have done some good things. Obviously, seeing the genius. You guys will have different perspectives on stable coins, but for me and the kind of broader ecosystem, seeing the Genius Act pass has been really good. And I think we hopefully get a market structure bill here. But, the foundational stuff here, the reason at least some of us are still here, was always about autonomy and to some extent privacy, uncensorability at very least, for which privacy is kind of a prerequisite. And so seeing that not highlighted by the current administration, I think not to be over dramatic, but I mean, it hurts my heart to a certain extent as somebody who has been in this space since 2013, which is when I first started writing about Bitcoin, to see essentially the total takeover by a mix of well-intentioned venture capitalists who are nonetheless constrained by the structure of markets, and total grifters who, crypto is this hot new thing and you can sell anybody a shitcoin for $1 million. I mean, that to a significant degree is the public perception of crypto, for good or worse. I think that there is, I will say, a certain cadre of principled conservatism that does align behind Trump, like it or not, and that does understand some of the stakes here. But I think a huge percentage of whether it's the Bitcoiners behind Trump or more generally crypto people who have aligned with the administration, I don't think there's a great understanding of the fundamental stakes here or why this matters. I think that it has very sadly become financialized. I mean, not unpredictably, but it has become hyper financialized and it's turbo gambling and nothing else really matters to a lot of people. So it's an uphill battle to make these broader stakes meaningful, unfortunately.
So the most meta question, I'll kind of wrap up with this, is you're an independent journalist, contributor, long story, focused on some of these niche topics. Like, what's your thought about the trajectory of independent journalism and the ability to cover and distribute these stories to the public?
Yeah. Well, to be fully transparent, I do some journalism now, and I do it mostly, on my own, under my own name. I don't make a full-time living from journalism currently, and I don't plan to going forward, frankly. I think that the space is in such a bad situation that, we're working on, a model for the rage that will be more sustainable. But it's going to be an uphill battle and people are doing it. So I do want to sound that optimistic note. We have things like Substack, and I think that, podcasts have become more sustainable. But the kind of reporting that I did about this trial, you have to have somebody just hand you a bunch of money and not hope to get any of it back, frankly. Because the business model has been so gutted, by Facebook, by Google, by, again, these, by the way, large entities that want to collect data on you. So the irony here is, again, it's sickening, frankly, that the news media has been captured / undermined by data collectors at scale, which is now leading to a lack of public awareness about the continuing efforts of the government to constrain privacy and force you to be surveilled forever for the profit of giant corporations. That's where we are in the news media right now. We're working on alternate models. We would love to circumvent that trap. But it remains to be seen where the future lies.
I feel you, David. It's funny because you mentioned like a lot of the work right now is funded through private donations. And it's a really funny, kind of interesting thing where we have this crazy wealth creation event happening in crypto over the past 15 years. And it's kind of, it's a double-sided. It's given a bunch of kind of crazy people a lot of money, but also it's given a lot of crazy people a lot of money, which is great. So it's two sides of the same coin. And it means, you do have some anonymous or non-public individuals, support those things.
And just really briefly, big thanks. I won't even risk using initials or a pseudonym, but we do have one backer who has really been a crucial catalyst for just this work and what we think is going to be a transition into the future. So shout out to that person. You know who you are.
Yeah, shout out to those people. I want to wrap this up. Final thoughts, David. Tornado Cash. Where do people go?
Yeah.
How much? Yeah.
So first of all, the timeline for any appeal is always very uncertain. It's really a question of potentially years. This is one really good part of the outcome of the trial, which was the prosecutors did move to remand Roman to custody ahead of sentencing. claiming he was a flight risk, which luckily the defense was able to convince the judge that was not the case. And Roman will be, I believe he will remain on effective house arrest, so very limited travel. But he is not in jail until sentencing, which is really, really good for him. And I think another thing I will say is, the judge in this case did make some balanced decisions. I did not perceive in the courtroom that there was bias against the defense and for the prosecution. And I think that, frankly, the verdict that we got reflects that the judge balanced her decisions, and a lot of them went to the defense and a lot of them went to the prosecution, and they were largely based on very reasonable interpretations of the law and the evidence. So credit to the judge there. So the appeals process, it's just a wait and see game. We don't know what's going to happen. But do wait and see. You can follow at The Rage Tech on Twitter. I'm at David Z. Morris. I also, so therage.co, go there and sign up for the newsletter. That will probably be a pretty big backbone of our operations going forward. I currently have my own newsletter, which focuses on fraud and scams at davidzmorris.substack.com. That's called Dark Markets, if you want to try and find it by other means. That we are anticipating will actually become part of The Rage. So we're going to be, on the one hand, reporting about privacy issues, on the other hand, investigating frauds and scams, which I think are sort of a paired proposition. And I'm just at David Z. Morris on X. And I think I'm the same tag on Farcaster if anybody uses that. Pardon me. So yeah, go follow all of those things. I'm all over the place doing probably a little bit too much. But also watch The Rage, because our first product, I believe, it could be a month, it could be longer than that, but we will be launching a podcast, and we'll be putting out information.
Yeah, I saw the interview you had with that team on the YouTube was very, very important and helped me kind of like consult, actually collate a lot of the information. That was, I recommend everybody else to go check that out. It's The Rage YouTube channel. Yeah,
it would be great if we could include a link to that. We had DeFi Education Fund. We had Peter Van Valkenburg. I believe, again, I've done so many of these over the past week. So,
they all blend together.
But shout out to DeFi Education Fund. They had people there watching. They're doing good work. Again, I mad respect for all my Bitcoiners, but hopefully this, for a few people, drives home that we are all on the same team to at least some extent. I apologize. I'm not trying to hard sell you on Ethereum or anything, but it does matter. So privacy is privacy. It doesn't matter which blockchain it's on. So we're Bitcoin Season 2. David, thank you so much for coming on the pod, and I'm certain we will cross paths someday in the future. Hopefully celebrating more trial victories. So yeah, Charlie, thanks for having me. This is very, very important. As much as I'm concerned about the lack of public awareness, I have been really gratified by how engaged the crypto community is with this. So it's really important. Thanks.